Hey guys, Brian here from Better Chess Training, and in today's video, I wanted to share a master game. Aron Nimzowitsch of My System fame, and Allan Nilsson, and this is from the tournament Copenhagen 1924. And let's get right into it. But the reason I wanted to show this to you, I was looking at this game the other day, and I have to admit, I have never been really a huge fan of Nimzowitsch, and I've never read My System. But after this game, I might want to reconsider some of that. So, kind of interesting. Starts off with a knight c3 kind of English opening, and um, develops quietly here. And again, we transpose into uh, sort of a semi-Slav type setup here, and kind of move quickly through the opening phase here. But um, here is kind of where the uh, landscape for the strategy in the game gets started. Because white is going to provoke this exchange of queens, and that could be a topic of itself, but we're not going to focus on that today. Um, Once we have the general idea here is we've got these two B pawns, and we can use them to try to create structural weakness in our opponent's camp, all the while starting to put pressure on this A pawn. Okay, knight B to D7, and then B5. Again, all according to the plan. King to E7. And here we don't want to rush and take here, okay? Because after B takes C6, now we have, our own weakness, and black has some counterplay. Something I've noticed in um, a lot of these old positional masters like Capablanca, Rubinstein, and Nimzowitsch is their ability to kind of control the action. Now, of course, part of this is that the opposition at the time was not able to maybe make the game as complex as possible. I mean, that's where you have players like Eliakin coming in and really mixing things up and making this style of play a little more difficult. But the idea is that by using prophylaxis or trying to shut down your opponent's idea, you can really control what's happening on the board. And that sometimes involves being patient. So going back here, so instead, let's see. Oh, instead, white plays b4. And again, this is always in the cards. And then we also have to also look for opportunities maybe to play b6. So there's not a set template, but you just have to look at the different possibilities. But it is a very nice position to have. Okay, black tries to uh, lash out here with a5, and there's a bunch of ways to do this. If he takes here, it's not quite so good because now black is the one who gets the counterplay, and it's not quite so pleasant here. Bishop takes d2, bishop takes, and then rook takes. And we can see here black, it's not lost for white, but black gets a nice initiative. He gets to the a file first with his rook. Okay, so instead, Nimzowitsch takes en passant, and this allows b takes a6. And at this moment, Nimzowitsch tries to exchange this bishop. This bishop, of course, is controlling a lot of key squares here, especially the b1 square, which will be used to defend the b pawn. And so he tries to exchange that off. Now, I was thinking maybe black could have dropped this back so that if white did exchange, he can black can take back and at least get some play down to h file. But that wasn't played. Instead, rook already pushing on this b pawn. So knight takes f5 check, e takes f5, and rook to b1. Rook to a4 would also be okay. And then it's important to note that Black's always looking for a way to play a5 here to get rid of this weakness and kind of free up his game a little, but doesn't quite work here and for the next few moves because after a5, white can push b5, and after we take here, then white just has a very nice position with this protected pass pawn. So that's sort of the um, the thing we're looking out for. If you're a defender, if you're black in this position, you're trying to avoid this. To some extent, it's very difficult to do so, as we'll see in the game. But you want to play that a5 to get rid of your weakness, and um, white's job in this case is to avoid making that a good idea. So let's go back here. Rook to b1. Again, same idea here. A5 is not playable here because of b5. Okay. So knight to e4. The idea is attacking one of these defenders here. But that's fine for white. White exchanges. And this is a theme that you'll see with these pawns here closed. Now the play is going to happen on the wings. Okay. And that's a general principle. And you're just the important part is to understand when to play the various pawn breaks in the position. Okay, so we'll see a little bit of that today. But today's game, I think, is going to focus a little more on the play of the rooks and playing on black's weaknesses. Okay, this next maneuver I thought was pretty neat. When I was looking through this game myself, I was wondering why can't I play bishop to d2 here? And again, as I mentioned earlier, because now it is possible to play a5. After b5, c takes b5, and if bishop takes b5, then black can double up here and cause some troubles. It's not, again, not necessarily losing for white, but uncomfortable compared to the position. And then if white takes here, then again, this is pretty uncomfortable here after rook to b8, because now we can't defend this. And let's say we move. Of course, we can exchange here, but black's going to win this exchange. Okay? So bishop to d2, protecting this pawn. Because what we want to do is we want to put this rook here on the a file. So what's the best way to do that, right? So Nimzowitsch comes up with a good idea, which also accomplishes a few aims here. He plays king to d2. So now the king is going to come over to defend this rook. The point being is that not only is the b pawn not defended, but this rook, this pawn is pinned as well. So king to d2, rook to b7, planning to double up here, king to c2. And now we're defended, and so after, well, knight to f6 is played first. Now bishop b2, so now the rooks are protecting each other. Knight to e8, and now rook to a1. So if we stop here and just take a look at the position, we see, yes, the b pawn is weak for white, but because the rook or the bishop is defending it, it's difficult to attack. Impossible to attack by the knight. There's no squares where the knight can get to at the moment, and unless the black wants to sacrifice the exchange, it's going to be difficult to win this pawn. On the other hand, the a6 pawn is going to require defending. Also, because it's on a light square, the bishop is not going to be able to defend it. And again, even though he wants to play a5 right now, is not such a great idea to do so. Okay, let's see what happens. Rook a to b7. Okay, preparing a defense here. And this is actually another very important point in the game. So, white can work to double these rooks and put pressure here, but black eventually will be able to defend it, this pawn fairly well. However, that defense is going to tie up these pieces. So one principle of chess is that when one front is kind of been exhausted in terms of your play, it's time to open up another front. And so here, white plays f3. He's going to open up the f file. Okay, f5 is played. F takes e4, f takes e4, and here rook to a2. So basically, white needs to keep up this pressure on the a pawn in order to make this work, and so he's going to plan to double to tie up black's pieces. Bishop to d8, rook h to a1, knight to c7. So black's defense is all set for this a pawn, and now white goes to another strategic maneuver, and that is to activate this bishop. So this bishop's been basically just sitting here defending this, and now he's going to serve another purpose, which you'll see shortly. Knight to b5, and that purpose is to exchange itself for the good black dark square bishop. King to e8, bishop takes e8, king takes e8, and bishop takes b5. Now, this exchange is another important point to talk about. And I see this in players like Capablanca. And if you study his games, you'll see it. Basically, once these masters sense that they can win the resulting endgame. So here, white assesses that this rook and pawn endgame is one for white. He gets rid of everything else. It's sort of like a math problem when you simplify to its everything to its simplest terms so that you can solve the problem. It's very similar to that concept. So even though this bishop is fairly active, it's going to exchange itself for the knight and make the position much easier to play. Not necessarily, it's not going to play itself, but white's knowledge and experience and skill, he's already determined that he can exchange these pieces and win the resulting endgame. So he takes, c takes b5, and now great principle. This game has so many lessons in it, which is why I wanted to share it with you. King to d2, and the idea is to bring this king over to the king side. King to e7, king to e2, king to e6, king to f2. By the way, just note, if black tries to just do a check here, there's no entry points for this rook to enter, and he has to go back here and defend the a-pawn anyway, unless he wants to lose the a-pawn. Okay, so king to d7 was played. Okay, rook to a5. I think he could have played king to g3 right away, but I think the idea here is just to prevent this advance and lock up these pawns for now. Okay, king to c6, trying to find a good defensive position, and king to g3. So now this game kind of goes in phases. Now that this king is in its optimal position, white is going to eventually bring his rook over and try to penetrate on the f-file. And I found this to be very instructive as well, because black at the moment is covering also the entry points. And so we're going to see how white gets into the position. King to b7. So he's adding this second defender here so that this rook can come over at some point. But the white rook gets there first. King to c6. He's kind of just marking time because he doesn't have much to do here. Rook to f5. And of course, he's putting pressure here. So now this king can't move anymore. And here, rook to e7. And this is an important point. The idea is that this rook, let's go back a position here. This rook wants to come in this way, okay? Since he can't go directly to the 6th rank on the f-file. So rook to e7, trying to stop that. So how are we going to make progress here? Because it may seem that black has everything kind of covered. Well, again, white employs another member of the army here, and that's the h-pawn. And the idea will be to disrupt this, especially this g7 pawn, so that we can get to the 6th rank. Okay, rook a to a7, h5, rook to e6. And because black left the 8th rank, that's where the rook is going to come in. There's a bunch of good moves here. Rook to f8. We could also play king to e4, just planning on infiltrating with the king. But rook to f8 was very good, of course. Okay, g6. And the idea here is if we take, then at least black gets a little counterplay. Should still be winning for white, but at least black gets to do something. Okay. Here, and I actually, this type of maneuver I saw in the Magnus Carlsen game is not to do anything with these pawns, but to use that opportunity to bring the king in. So he could have done that, but instead he plays h6. And at first I thought this was vulnerable, but he has an idea in mind, which I'll show you next, which is what is played. After g5, the h6 pawn is attacked, and now he plays rook to b8. And the idea is if the rook takes, now we've got this nice skewer. Okay, let's go back. King to c7 is played instead. And here we have an opportunity. If you want, pause the video and see if you can figure it out. Here, white plays rook b takes b5, winning a pawn. Of course, this pawn is pinned, so he doesn't take. Rook takes h6. Okay, and now we're preparing to move this rook over. Rook comes back to the f file. Rook b to a5. Okay, king to c8. King to g4, improving his king. h6, protecting the pawn. And here, by the way, we want to play b5, but we can't play it right now. If we play it right now, we get this. Rook takes, and then the pawn takes. And after rook takes a4, this black rook becomes much more active. This should still be winning for white, but it's just a little bit tougher than what happened in the game. So instead, rook to a2, so now we can play b5. Okay, so black basically abandons the a pawn and tries to get more activity elsewhere. Rook takes a6, rook takes, and then rook to f2. So we don't want to lose our pawn, so we play g3. Rook to b2, attacking this pawn. And here, there's a little bit of an exchange. Rook takes h6. And instead of taking this, because, I mean, again, it's a tough position for black. But if he takes here, then we're just taking here, and it's just too many pawns. So this part I won't spend too much time on. Rook to d6, rook takes e3, rook takes, rook to d3, and b5, e3, and not here with the rook because you're going to lose this pawn. Instead, he brought the king over to defend, and at that point, black resigned. So I really enjoyed this game, and it was very instructive because I've always had trouble finding ways to utilize weaknesses in terms of the semi-open file with the rooks, and then but now we can open up another front and penetrate on a different file with our rooks, and also the use of the H pawn in order to break open or potentially break open black's structure in order to find those entry points. So I thought those to be very instructive parts of this game, and I hope you did as well.